Britain just woke up in a different country. Europe's freezing hundreds of billions forever. Paris can't throw a party anymore. And halfway across the world, a state just legalized something that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. By the time we're done today, you'll see how these seemingly separate stories connect into one massive shift. And trust me, the most interesting part is waiting at the end of this episode. I spent years inside one of those big, prestigious media organizations, the kind everyone assumes tells you the truth. What I saw was different. Stories bent to fit the narrative, facts trimmed to protect the powerful, whole angles buried because they made the wrong people uncomfortable. So I walked away. Now I work for you. I answer to nobody else. And what you're about to hear is exactly what matters. No filter, no spin. Now, before we dive deep, do me a favor. If this kind of honest breakdown is what you're looking for, hit that like button, smash subscribe, and here's the thing, consider supporting the channel directly. We spend hours fact-checking every claim, cross-referencing sources, making sure we're not feeding you nonsense like so much of what's out there. It's hard work, but it matters, and your support keeps us independent. And please, stick around until the end, because what I've saved for last will completely reframe everything we're about to discuss. Let's start in a tiny Scottish town called Whitburn. You've probably never heard of it. Historically, elections there were simple. SNP versus Labour, local issues, familiar faces. Yesterday, a candidate from Reform UK, a guy named David McLennan, quietly walked into the local council and won. The old brands, the parties that dominated British politics for generations, just stood there watching him take his seat. To London, this looks like a fluke on the edge of the map. Some random anomaly in Scotland. But what if I told you it's actually the first crack in a gigantic dam that's about to break? Because while Whitburn was making local news, national polling was dropping a bomb. YouGov, one of the most respected survey firms in Britain, shows Reform UK pulling around 27% support nationwide. That puts them ahead of Labour, ahead of the Conservatives, leading the country. Other polls show them approaching a third of all voters. These aren't fringe supporters or protest votes anymore. These are people who voted Conservative last time, voted Labour the time before, and now they're telling pollsters, coldly, simply, enough. Here's where it gets wild. Political scientists are scratching their heads because Reform UK doesn't have the traditional party infrastructure, no decades in power, no network of local offices across every constituency, and yet they're holding on to 95% of their voters. Meanwhile, the Conservatives and Labour are hemorrhaging support, losing about half of the people who believed in them just one election cycle ago. British politics, famously stable, famously slow-moving, suddenly finds itself in a tornado. MPs are looking at these graphs, quietly trying on new party colours in their minds, and the old headquarters are starting to discuss coalition scenarios, alliances against what they're literally calling the barbarians at the gates. But here's the thing voters don't care about. They're not listening to the old parties anymore. They're listening to the new one, the one promising to tear down everything that's corrupt and rotten. For a country that's been taught for generations to live by the rules of Westminster, to respect the process, to trust the system, this isn't just protest. This is a referendum on whether the entire old political class needs to exist at all. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with Europe, with global finance, with anything beyond Britain's borders? Hold that thought, because what's happening in Brussels right now is going to make your head spin, and it connects to this British story in ways you haven't considered yet. Several hundred kilometers away, in the glass buildings of Brussels, European bureaucrats are quietly doing something that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. Under the cover of an emergency provision, Article 122, they've just permanently blocked 210 billion euros of Russian state assets sitting in the European financial system. Let me say that again. Permanently, no return date. 185 billion of that is frozen inside Euroclear, a massive Brussels-based financial giant. Another 25 billion or so is scattered across private banks, and now it's money without an expiration date on the freeze. They don't need to gather unanimous consent every 6 months anymore. Don't need to worry that Budapest or Bratislava might suddenly block the decision. A qualified majority is enough to keep these funds locked in the basement of European politics until Russia pays for the destruction, as the Council decisions explicitly state. Officially, this is about justice, about supporting Ukraine, about holding aggressors accountable. But the real battle is raging over something else entirely. How exactly do you use the interest from these assets and eventually the capital itself to raise up to 165 billion euros for a reparations loan to Kyiv without destroying Euroclear in the process and dragging Belgium's budget into a legal nightmare? Belgium, where most of these assets physically sit, is terrified. They're worried that premature transfer of the money will trigger lawsuits, claims running into the billions if someday, somehow, something has to be returned. And here's why London is watching this with nervous attention. The British capital, always jealous of its status as a global financial hub, understands perfectly that this precedent of eternal freeze, of turning someone else's reserves into a political weapon, could be pointed at Britain tomorrow. The question, why shouldn't Britain do the same thing, is already starting to sound less like theory and more like a political demand. But wait, because the real chill running down the spine of Britain's middle class comes from another European development, one that hits much closer to home, literally in your mailbox. EU countries have just agreed to introduce, starting July 1st, 2026, a fixed fee of €3 on every cheap imported package, while simultaneously eliminating the familiar duty-free threshold for small online shopping. Millions of people who've gotten used to ordering everything, phone cases, electronics, random gadgets, from platforms like AliExpress, are suddenly discovering that every little item is going to carry a small but painful tax. And small taxes add up fast. Officially, this scheme is temporary, a bridge to full VAT on all packages. But in reality, it looks like a test. How far can you go taxing the global internet fire sale before consumers openly revolt? Britain isn't in the EU anymore, right? But let's not kid ourselves. London has spent decades moving in Brussels' wake when it comes to regulating e-commerce and taxation, and officials in Whitehall are almost certainly already reviewing similar options, eyeing those tempting extra billions. For British viewers, this isn't some abstract argument about tariffs. This is a direct hit on something intimate, the shopping cart that's become part of daily life, especially in the provinces, especially among younger people. If Europe successfully sells this tax to its citizens, nothing stops the British Treasury from announcing that the era of free shipping is over and you'll be paying extra for every cheap package. In a world where Reform UK is already riding a wave of protest, a new tax on dreams shipped from China might be the perfect fuel for another fire. Are you starting to see the pattern yet? Political earthquakes in Britain, financial weaponization in Brussels, and now direct taxation of ordinary people's consumption habits. But hold on, because France is about to send a signal that'll make Britain shiver just as much as those poll numbers. Paris has just cancelled the live New Year's concert on the Champs-Élysées, the one that used to bring about 1 million people into the heart of the city. Authorities are saying they can't guarantee safety, can't manage the risks of mass incidents, and instead of a live show, the country gets a pre-recorded television performance. Sterile, controlled, no crowds, no spontaneity. For French commentators, this is a litmus test. Years of unmanaged migration, rising street conflicts, outbreaks of disorder, it all collapses into one image, a city that's no longer confident it can safely celebrate in its main square. British viewers, who've always compared themselves to Paris, see a troubling mirror in this. If there, on the Champs-Élysées, you can't gather 1 million people anymore without fear, something fundamental has changed in how Europe lives and feels in its own capitals. Public space, recently a symbol of freedom, is now framed not just by cameras, but by the idea that it's better to lock people in their homes and give them a tidy television spectacle instead of a real celebration. In British discussions about migration, safety, and zones where police fear to patrol, this French story becomes more than news. It's a warning. Europe is gradually getting used to the idea that big public celebrations are simply too dangerous. Think about that for a second. The Champs-Élysées, one of the most iconic streets on the planet, and they can't throw a party there anymore. What does that tell you about the state of things? What does it say about where we're headed? And if it's happening there, how long before it happens here? Before we go further, quick reminder, if you're finding value in this kind of analysis, drop a comment below, let me know what you think, and don't forget to subscribe. We're building something different here, and your engagement is what makes it possible. Now, across the Atlantic, Illinois is throwing down a challenge not just to American values, but to British morality as well. Democratic Governor Jay Pritzker just signed into law SB 1950, the End-of-Life Options for Terminally Ill Patients Act, known as Debs Law. The state just became the 13th U.S. jurisdiction to legalize medical assistance in voluntary departure from life. Starting in autumn 2026, adult Illinois residents with a terminal diagnosis and a prognosis of 6 months or less can request a prescription for a lethal medication from their doctor, which they must take themselves after 2 independent confirmations and a series of oral and written requests. Supporters call it the right to pass with dignity. Opponents call it state-sanctioned self-harm. Catholic bishops in Illinois warn it puts the state on a dangerous and tragic path. According to organizations tracking these practices, 11 states and the federal district had already permitted medical aid in passing. And in Canada, up to 1 in every 20 losses of life per year now involves euthanasia, a figure that shocks even analysts who thought they'd seen everything. For Britain, where Parliament regularly argues about the boundaries of the right to life and the alternative, this isn't just distant American novelty. This is a possible script for future debates in Westminster. When doctors get legal authority to help a patient depart, and the state formalizes this as an option within the medical system, society is forced to answer a question it's been putting off for decades. Who ultimately controls a person's life? The individual themselves, the family, the doctors, or the law? On a day when British politics is shattering old taboos, Europe is learning to freeze hundreds of billions, Paris is refusing to celebrate, and Illinois is codifying the right to choose your end, it becomes clear. The West has entered an era where familiar moral and political coordinates no longer function, and it's on days like these that history most often changes direction. Let me pull this together for you, because these aren't random events scattered across the map. They're symptoms of the same disease. In Britain, voters aren't just switching parties. They're rejecting the entire concept of the old political class, the Westminster rules, the decades of being told to trust the process. That's why Reform UK isn't just winning polls, they're holding their voters at 95% while the establishment parties bleed support. That's not normal political movement. That's a collapse of legitimacy. In Brussels, the decision to permanently freeze Russian assets isn't just about Ukraine. It's about establishing a precedent that state reserves, the bedrock of international finance, can become political weapons with no expiration date. Every finance minister on the planet is watching and wondering if their country's assets could be next. The new tax on cheap packages isn't about revenue. It's about testing how much economic pain ordinary people will tolerate before they push back. It's about seeing if governments can chip away at the one area where globalization actually benefited regular consumers, cheap goods from abroad, without triggering a revolt. France cancelling the Champs-Élysées celebration isn't about one concert. It's about European capitals admitting they've lost control of public space, that the social fabric has frayed so badly they can't safely gather their own citizens for a party. And Illinois legalizing medical assistance in voluntary departure isn't about individual choice in a vacuum. It's about normalizing state-facilitated ending of life, turning what was once unthinkable into a checkbox on a medical form. You see the thread now. Every one of these stories is about power. Who has it, who's losing it, and what happens when the old rules stop working. Britain's voters are seizing power back from a political class they no longer trust. Brussels is seizing financial assets and wielding them as geopolitical weapons. Governments are seizing more tax revenue from daily consumption. Cities are seizing public celebrations out of fear they can't manage them. And states are seizing the authority to formalize pathways out of existence. The West isn't just changing policies, it's rewriting the fundamental contract between citizens and power, between nations and finance, between the individual and the state. And here's what most people are missing. This is all happening simultaneously because the old system, the one built after World War II, the one that promised stability, prosperity, and predictable rules, that system is breaking down. Not slowly, not gradually, right now. The political earthquakes, the financial weaponization, the taxation of ordinary life, the retreat from public space, the normalization of state-facilitated conclusions to life, these aren't separate policy debates. They're all pressure points on a structure that's failing. So what comes next? That's the question everyone should be asking, but almost nobody is. Because when legitimacy collapses, when financial rules become weapons, when governments can't guarantee basic public safety, when the boundary between life and state-sanctioned alternatives dissolves, you're not in a stable system anymore. You're in transition. And transitions are when anything becomes possible. That's why the Reform UK surge matters beyond Britain. It's a signal that voters everywhere are ready to blow up the old arrangements. That's why the asset freeze matters beyond Russia. It's a signal that international finance is now a battlefield, not a neutral system. That's why the package tax matters beyond online shopping. It's a signal that governments are desperate for revenue and willing to squeeze it from anywhere. That's why the Paris cancellation matters beyond one concert. It's a signal that European social order is fragmentally fragile, and that's why the Illinois law matters beyond one state. It's a signal that fundamental questions about existence, agency, and state power are all back on the table. If you've stuck with me this far, thank you, seriously. This kind of deep analysis only works when people are willing to engage with complexity to see the connections that the mainstream misses. So do me one last favor, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and if you believe in what we're building here, consider supporting us directly. We're not beholden to anyone, and that independence is what lets us tell you what really matters. The world you wake up in tomorrow isn't the one you went to sleep in yesterday. The coordinates have shifted, the rules are being rewritten, and the only way to navigate what's coming is to understand what's actually happening, not what you're being told is happening. That's what we do here, that's why you're here, and that's why this matters. Before we close, I want to have a moment of real talk with you. We are living through a time where information is weaponized, and the truth is often the first casualty. You've seen today how we connect the dots that others are paid to ignore. But I have to be honest, this isn't easy. Sifting through the noise, reading the fine print of legislation, and rigorously fact-checking every claim to ensure you never get fed fake news, it is an exhausting, around-the-clock grind. The major networks have massive budgets and corporate masters. I have none of that. I traded that security for the freedom to speak the truth to you, but that means this channel survives solely on the backing of people like you. If you value this independence, if you want a source that respects you enough to give you the raw reality, please hit that like button and subscribe right now. And if you are able, I warmly invite you to become a sponsor. Your contribution isn't just a donation, it's a direct vote for integrity over the narrative. Help us keep doing the hard work that keeps us all free. Until next time.